All right, well, thank you, Nick and Glenda, for this very insightful discussion. So as Melissa mentioned earlier, I'm Pascal Poupart. I'm the interim research director here at Vector, and I'm really excited to welcome everybody here for an exciting day, in fact, exciting 2 days of research. So we're going to have several research talks, and it wasn't easy to select some interesting, thought-provoking, and breakthrough talks, but I should say that ultimately everyone here at Vector and also with our partners is contributing to research. So I want to thank everybody for making AI remarkable and really advancing the state of the art. So today we're going to focus on a couple of talks that are making a difference for Canadians, do exemplify some of the impact that AI is having. And in that respect, our first talk is going to be by Chris Maddison. So let me tell you a bit more about Chris. So he's an outstanding researcher. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. Before that, he did his PhD at Oxford University. And there he won a prize, the Cochrane Prize for his thesis. He also won several prizes at various machine learning conferences, and he is well renowned in the community. Chris is also a leader when it comes to machine learning methodologies, in particular in terms of designing algorithms that can learn to make good predictions in stubbornly complex settings like medicine and drug discovery. Chris is also known for his gradient estimation techniques, which are now standard tools in deep learning toolbox. And he also had a role as a founding member in the AlphaGo project, which has defeated the world champion several years ago and has inspired so many of us to make additional contribution in AI. So without any further ado, let me welcome Chris Maddison.
Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. I want to start by thanking Pascal for the wonderful introduction and thank the AV folks for putting up with my last-minute slide preparation. So I want to speak to you today about what I think is the most important problem facing us in artificial intelligence. In particular, the problem of finding signal when data is scarce and when verification is expensive. So I'd like to start by setting that problem up. I have to start with a slide or a figure that is in almost all of our talks nowadays. This is a figure showing over time the investment of computational resources in building AI models. So on the x-axis is the publication date of a paper. On the y-axis is the amount of training computation that was spent to produce the model. So you can see, and that's in log space. So we've been investing exponentially more compute over time in building our models. And one of the contentions I have is that this is made possible by what is actually a pretty simple recipe that we're repeating over and over again. And the recipe roughly has 2 steps. Sometimes we can omit the first step, but the 2 steps are, number 1, pre-train your model to predict something on a very large data set. And number 2, take that model that was pre-trained and post-train it to maximize some kind of reward that aligns it with our goals. If you work in large language models, this recipe is very classic now, but actually it's been around for a while. It's not new, and actually has been showing reliable results for about a decade. Pascal mentioned that I was one of the founding members of the AlphaGo team, and I was recently reflecting on the fact that we used actually exactly the same recipe The recipe that is used for LLMs today was the recipe we used for AlphaGo. So on the bottom left is a figure from an iClear paper that we published in 2015 before the AlphaGo results were released. In this paper, I was interested in studying move prediction by neural networks, and so we took big data sets of expert Go players, of the games that they played with each other, and we trained a neural network to predict the move that the expert would pick. One of the interesting little anecdotes, this figure on the left is actually, in a sort of hidden way, a scaling plot related to the scaling laws that we look at all the time now in large language models. I actually plotted it in the wrong way at the time. So on the x-axis is the number of moves that I'm considering in my prediction, and the y-axis is the accuracy of the neural network. But what I want you to focus on is actually for one of the columns there, the dots that are moving up as the color darkens. That series is showing deeper and deeper neural networks being trained on the same data. And what it's showing is that as you invest more parameters in your models, their ability to predict the next move improves. That's exactly the same kind of thing we see in large language models when they're predicting the next token. So that was just a move predictor, but then in AlphaGo, we took that network and we exposed it to a reinforcement learning environment where it was playing against itself and verifying its results against the rules of the game of Go, which we know and can compute efficiently on a computer. And so the figure I want you to focus on the right is actually the middle one. As you go from right to left, you can kind of think of that as that. Technically, that's adding components in the search algorithm. But you can think of that as basically exposing the system to more and more evaluations of the verification rules of the game of Go. And so as you go from right to left, you're extracting more information about the game. And on the y-axis is the performance of the search algorithm. And so we had this sort of two-part recipe where we started by predicting the expert's next move and then exposed it to a reinforcement learning system. And you all know the results. The AlphaGo system, which was built by an incredible team at DeepMind, went on to defeat Lee Sedol, who was the world champion at Go in 2016. So this recipe relies on two things. One is abundant data. In AlphaGo, that was the expert next move. And cheap verification. In AlphaGo, that was our ability to implement the rules of a game on a computer. Large language models, I would argue, are actually using the same basic resources. When we train a large language model, we start by pre-training it to predict the next token on a vast data set of text derived from the internet. And then we post-train the models against human preferences, compilers, theorem provers, and various other sort of cheap, in quotes, verification. And when you can do that, we're seeing incredible progress, as everyone in this room knows. So the figure I have here is the progress over time in the model's ability to execute human tasks autonomously for longer and longer time periods. And as you can see, for the tasks considered by Meter, the agency that's measuring this, we're getting, again, a kind of exponential increase over time. One thing I want to point out about this plot, which a lot of people look at and have sort of commented on, is that the tasks that are considered here are largely software engineering tasks, which tend to admit of cheaper verification. So the question I want to pose is, well, what do we do when we don't have abundant data and we don't have cheap verification? And actually, some of society's and our species' most important problems have this nature. So predicting the toxicity of a drug candidate is an extremely expensive proposition that you have to verify with a clinical trial that can cost upwards of $100 million. Even worse, predicting the effect of a policy intervention on society can be so expensive as to destroy nation states. So we can't run that experiment very often. So just to drive the point home, I have here a figure of the number of drugs approved per $1 billion spent in R&D over time. And again, the y-axis is in log scale, And so you can see we're actually trending exponentially in the opposite direction of the meter evals in society. It's becoming more and more expensive for us to approve drugs. So that's the question that I think is the most important problem, open problem in artificial intelligence. So I'm going to present 3 results, 2 that come from my group that sort of seem to address this. And the key theme that I want to highlight is that in some ways these results look like they're getting, quote, blood from a stone, like they're getting something from nothing. So after these 3 results, I want to reflect a little bit on perhaps what's happening and what conclusions we can draw when thinking about the future. These are all going to be a little bit scattered and addressing different problems. But to start, I want to talk about a work we published at Nature Machine Intelligence called PAIR. And to understand the work, you have to understand how biology and computational biology is building their so-called large genomics models. So some of the most abundant data in biology is genomics data, and there's been a lot of animation and excitement about building large models that look much like the large language models, but trained just on genomic sequences, on sequences of genetic information. So in the figure here, I have an example sequence highlighted in red. This is a sequence of amino acids that represents a protein. This is insulin. And we have big databases of sequences like this and sequences of wider genomes. And so a lot of folks have been training on this sort of data. And part of what animates this is that they have shown that if you do this, you get an emerging understanding within these large genomics models of structural and functional information of the proteins themselves. So there's been a lot of excitement in this space in computational biology. Yet, one thing that my group observed is that these genome databases contain tokens, they contain data that are typically not used. So here is the same database, UniProt, on the left, and you can see at the top of insulin's entry, there's some text describing its function that was annotated by humans. So in this project, we asked, what if we took that data, that surrounding text data, and used it to fine-tune the representation of one of these large genomics models? And there's all sorts of information, from functional information that I just described, all the way to, say, paper titles that study that protein. We took a pretty simple approach. We started with an existing protein language model. We added our own text decoder following that and trained the model, fine-tuned these 2 models to decode the text that was found in conjunction with the protein sequence. And then at test time, we took our fine-tuned protein encoder, aggregated its embeddings, and then tested the quality of that representation against a baseline. So these are some of the results we got. So the test we did was we took these embeddings and we tested them in a k-nearest neighbor setup. This specific plot is looking at the effect of fine-tuning across different annotation types. So for every row in this figure, we take a certain type of annotation from UniProt, and we fine-tune to decode just that annotation type. And then what we're measuring is the performance of the embeddings as compared to the baseline model before fine-tuning in terms of other tasks. So tasks, functional prediction tasks that were held out, that the model was not trained on. And the bars here are like differences in performance. So as you go to the right, you get an improvement over the baseline. As you go to the left, you are losing against the baseline in terms of all those different downstream tasks of interest. And so basically, the point I'm trying to highlight here is that if you fine-tune on a number of these annotation types, you get an improvement over the baseline in terms of the quality of the representation for functional prediction tasks. Some of these are not super surprising. So for example, the third from the top is function. It's not so shocking that if you fine-tune to decode functional tokens, tokens that describe the function of a protein, that the representation of the protein model would improve for function prediction tasks. That's not so surprising. I guess what I found a bit more surprising is that you still see similar effects when predicting just the recommended name of the protein or the keywords associated with the entry in the protein. And so what's exciting about this for me is that basically somehow in the tokens that represent the names that humans have given to proteins is contained information about their function. That's not so surprising, actually, if you think about it a little bit more, because we use names to communicate that information. But it highlights that information can be hidden in surprising places. OK, so this result is not from my group. This is a result that sort of shows up all over the literature and is exploited by large language model trainers. This is known as the generator verifier gaps. So there are many different ways you can query a large language model. One way to query a large language model is as a generator. So here on the right, I'm asking, well, this is not my figure, but we're asking a large language model, rewrite the input text to be more humorous. Input, the economy is bad. And what you're testing is the ability of the model to generate a humorous response. Another way to query a large language model is to ask it to perform as a verifier. So instead of asking it to generate the continuation de novo, we give it a candidate continuation and see whether it's able to respond appropriately. So here, validator query. Which is more humorous? The economy is bad, or you could use a dollar bill to light a fire. OK? And one thing that people noticed is that there's often a gap between these two different ways of querying the model. And often they're inconsistent with each other. So a model might generate a humorous query that it thinks that its verifier thinks is not humorous. Okay, so often there's an inconsistency between what the model generates and how it verifies its own generations. And so a natural question then to ask is, well, can we exploit this? Can we use this in some way to improve the large language model? So the paper I'm citing here used this inconsistency to basically try to improve the models. And they took a certain approach, so-called generator verifier consistency, which is an instance of a bigger, sort of a more inclusive approach, which is basically to construct a synthetic verifier for post-training that benefits from these generator verifier gaps. So what they did in that paper was take a data set, generate completions, and then filter that data set according to the completions that the verifier thought were accurate. So basically, they sort of self-verified and then fine-tune on the higher quality filtered data, right? So just to highlight here, in this process, no new data is acquired. This is just the model somehow, using the model somehow to refine itself. And this is sort of the sense in which I mean some of these methods appear to be bleeding the stone. We're not getting more data, and yet somehow we're able to improve the performance. So in this paper, they showed that their strategy can improve the accuracy of the model across a number of tasks. I'm showing here arithmetic in the table. OK, and now the third result is from a paper that we called Reasoning to Learn. And the basic intuition from this result is that when you find text on the internet, there's a lot of information that's not actually being annotated and stored. In particular, some of the information that you might want are the thoughts of the person writing that text. And the reason you might want thoughts is that thoughts can typically make the prediction problem easier. OK, so here's a really simple example. Let's say your prefix is the word my, and you're trying to predict the next token. Suppose on the internet, what you've observed is that the next token is Fido, right? That's pretty hard to predict. How do I even know you're thinking, for example, about a dog? But it's possible that the writer, when they wrote the word my, had in their mind been thinking, oh, my pet dog named Fido. And they only needed to write down the last tokens corresponding to Fido. And so if you had observed the thoughts, pet dog named, the prediction problem would have overall been easier. The problem, of course, is that thoughts aren't observed. We don't see them. They're not written down. So in this project, we asked ourselves, can we somehow get around this? Can we infer thoughts during pre-training to improve the data efficiency of training the models? OK, so I don't want to over-egg this, because we had a specific approach. We had a certain algorithm that we used. I don't actually think the details are super, super important, but I want to give you at least the flavor of how we thought about it. So starting on the right, this figure, the idea was we would start with some kind of base model that was already pre-trained on text data. We would warm start, given some data that already had observed thoughts, train a latent thought model that is able to infer thoughts and able to produce text that includes the thoughts interleaved. We would then use that initial latent thought model to annotate an existing additional data from a corpus of just observed text tokens. So we're basically injecting thoughts into an observed corpus, create a new corpus of annotated data, and then retrain on that. So sort of close the loop and iterate this cycle. That was the idea. So basically, have a little bit of warm start data, but then a bootstrapped method that annotates its own thoughts. Okay? Mechanically, what we would do is on the right. So starting at the top, that would be a document. The big blue box is a document. We'd take a document, chunk it. For each of the chunks, we would use our current iteration of the latent thought model to infer what the thoughts would be. And then we had some clever way of ordering the thoughts and the observed tokens to indicate to the model whether it was being trained as an inference latent thought model or a joint model of thoughts and observed tokens. But we would ultimately just train standard next token prediction on the extended annotated data that now has the thoughts interleaved. OK, so I'm just going to show you one result. Let's focus on the right. So on the right figure, on the x-axis, we have the total training tokens. That includes latent thoughts for the latent thought models. But for our baselines, we basically allowed them to train over more of the data. OK, so the baselines that we considered were a raw token match, where we matched the number of tokens, and a training flop match, where we allowed the model to train on more tokens to match the amount of compute that was spent by the latent thought models. And then the three colored lines, blue, orange, and green, represent increasing numbers of iterations of that bootstrap cycle. So for every time up to 4 times in this iteration cycle, we saw an improvement in the performance. OK, so some of these might be more surprising than others, the fact that they lead to some kind of improvement. But what's common among all of them is that we are not getting any new data. And I've always found that a little bit surprising. And that led to the title of the talk, which was getting blood from a stone. How are we somehow extracting more information from the same pool of data? And I guess one of my predispositions is to think that there's not much magic in the world. And I think probably there's a simple explanation for all of these results and a number of so-called synthetic approaches. And so I'd like to conjecture that it's actually always just been about finding the data. It's always just the data or the verification algorithm that you have access to. And in particular, that these 3 examples that I showed you amount to finding data that can be leveraged into the capability of interest. Maybe a little bit more technically, they might all just be some kind of elaborate form of distillation. So for example, in the generator verifier gap result, if your data set contains examples of verification, you can leverage those into generation in the way that we do with synthetic verifiers. So basically, for the generator, you've effectively increased its effective data set size by noticing that you have data for a task that generation reduces to. I think that could also explain the latent thought augmentation, that basically, if there are thought tokens in the data set already, you can somehow leverage those into better performance on the data points where you don't observe those latent thought tokens. So I guess just to reflect a little bit, some of the good news here is that data can be refined in surprising ways. And there's actually more information out there in our data sets than maybe we initially realized. I think this is very, very analogous to something that we traditionally think of as a problem in machine learning, which is that information tends to be very leaky. The traditional way we think about this being a problem is in the design of our test train splits. We drill into students' heads the idea that they have to work really hard to avoid information leaking from their test set into their training procedures or their model selection procedures. But in this case, the leakiness of information may be something that we can use to our advantage. I guess the bad news, if this conjecture is true, is that we're probably fundamentally still limited by data. So I want to sort of draw an analogy here to kind of classical economics, which I don't know anything about. But my vague understanding of it is that capital and labor require land to be productive. And I think there's a very strong analogy in machine learning, which is that compute and algorithms require data to be productive. So this has led folks to ask questions like, will we run out of data? There's this nice study from folks, I think, at Epic AI, where they were trying to estimate the point at which we will basically hit the ceiling of data available for us to train our models on. Of course, the amount of data in the world is increasing over time, but the rate at which it's increasing is probably not enough to feed our models. And so they estimated that around between 2028 and 2030, we would hit that ceiling and suddenly be bottlenecked by the rate at which we can produce data in our world. I think this analogy with natural resources is actually very, very deep. The idea of prospecting for natural resources has strong analogies to finding new data sources, extraction to collecting data, and refining to curating data. OK, so I'll just end on a couple sort of scattered thoughts. One is, this is maybe more for the folks that are not building large language models, but are instead in sort of AI for science. I see a lot of unimodal models, like the large genomics models, that are trained on massive data sets. And often the animating question there is like, how much can we get out of that data for downstream prediction? But I think we should just be moving towards training large multimodal models on all of the data. We should never leave tokens on the table. And once we've saturated that, we should try to think of clever ways to maximize the leverage of the data that we do have. Then, just thinking a little bit about the consequences of building this technology, these are just speculations. I actually have no expertise in predicting the future. But if we're worried about our jobs, as is a discussion that we're all having in various places as large language models progress, I think this point of view can give you some insight into the capabilities that might be more protected, that might be better stores of value than others. So capabilities that involve, expensive, unpredictable, or poorly documented interactions might provide most opportunity for differentiation for humans and corporations. And often those types of capabilities are capabilities that involve interaction with the real world. In contrast, capabilities that involve sort of predictable interactions that are living and stored largely in the world of bits, unfortunately most of the things I'm good at, might actually be commoditized quite rapidly. And I think that is what's happening. Of course, again, I don't want to over-egg this. It's really hard to predict where the boundaries are going to lie. Capabilities are interdependent. You might get very good at one capability but miss another crucial interdependent ability that means the overall system's not as effective as an agent as you thought. And as we've just discussed, generalization can kind of tap these unknown reservoirs of information in sneaky ways that you don't realize. So information can leak, which might change how fast we make progress. Okay, and I just want to end by thanking all my collaborators here at U of T and Stanford. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the great presentation. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. So I'd like to invite people to come up to the mic and please ask your questions. So first question here.
Hi, Chris. Great talk. Thank you. I wonder if the genetics example, by including the annotations from scientists about these particular findings and that findings, introduces a level of subjectivity into the analysis, because you can have optimistic scientists that give, I found this is the gene for this cancer or whatever. And well, any comment on that?
Okay, so I think the question was, are we sort of introducing subjectivity into our analysis here? I think the answer is yes. And the challenge disentangling this is that the evaluations probably reflect the same subjective biases as the annotations themselves. So the annotations, let's just go with function because that's somehow the easiest. The function annotation is curated by humans. And so if there's a bias in the community in terms of what function they think that protein serves, then that will be reflected in that annotation. The evaluations we did, which was, for example, looking at predicting the EC number, which describes for enzymes what a category of their function, will probably reflect the same bias because it's also curated by the community. We were very careful to remove as much of explicit mentions of EC number or Go number or other sort of things that were in our eval, but nevertheless, there are these latent variables that we don't observe that are leaking this information, and those latent variables are often, decisions that humans have made, which are going to be subject to bias. So, yeah, I think it's a good point.
So, on the question of the verifier and the generator, I just want to understand, are you using this at scale? You're saying that's a way of training? Because there are techniques that are currently becoming more commoditized, I guess, where we use LLM as a judge, or we have a consortium of LLMs making different judgment and then comparing the results and having them criticize each other. Is that similar or is that different?
Sorry, I didn't hear everything. Are you referring to this work?
No, there is the verification generation.
Oh, this one.
Yes, so you're saying I'm going to generate and then I'm going to validate. And currently we have techniques like when we generate something with an LLM and then we ask the LLM to judge it.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you ask multiple LLMs to generate and then compare the generation and they judge each other.
Yeah.
Is that something similar, or is this technique like different in a way, like at scale?
Yeah, I guess I would argue they're all very similar and that they're all relying on the same kind of underlying sources of data. That's just a guess, it's a conjecture. I think the best way to compare algorithms and approaches is just to ask what information are they using about the problem of interest. And I think all of these approaches that are using the LLM as a judge are fundamentally relying on data sources that have examples of good judgment.
No, I think, okay, so following up on that, just to make sure I understand. We can do that now, and it works, and it's perfectly fine. My question is, in here, are you somehow feeding that judgment into the LLM, so in the future it makes better prediction?
Yes.
Or is that just one shot as we do it?
No, this is feeding, so yeah, just to clarify. So first of all, this wasn't our result. This is someone else's paper. But what they do in this paper is take a data set of generations and then run the verifier over all those generations and filter it down to the ones where the verifier thought it was a good example of whatever the task was, and then fine-tuned the generator on that filtered set. So basically, it's like refining the generator to look more like a generator that the verifier would like. And it's all the same underlying model that's doing the filtration and the generation in the first step. Yeah.
All right, one last question.
Hi, so I have a question. If we're using the information about the information that we already inferred from the information that we had, how can we be sure that we're generalizing our knowledge and not just overlearning the initial source of information?
Yeah, how can we ensure we've generalized? I guess I'm pretty pessimistic on that account. I don't know that we can. I mean, the best way is to design evaluations that are truly held out from the internet. I guess that's the gold standard. And even then, the evaluations are going to be imperfect. So, for example, in AlphaGo, well, I guess this is not a great slide for that, but one of the components of the search is a value network that's basically looking at a board position and saying, how good is that board, do I think I'm going to win in that position? Of course, the verifier, the value network can make mistakes because it's trained on a data set of games and outcomes. And if you're running a search over an imperfect heuristic, to the extent that the heuristic is correct, in positions where it's correct, then the search is doing the right thing. But in the positions where your heuristic is confidently wrong, in the wrong direction, the search can actually look for those positions. It can look for positions where you've made the biggest mistakes in the optimistic direction. And that did happen with AlphaGo. And actually, funny enough, we estimated that the probability of that happening was about 20%. So in about 20% before the match release at all, about 20% of the games, we would run into that kind of hallucination, basically. And we lost 1 out of the 5 games of the match, and it was for that reason. So our estimate was pretty good, and it did happen quite a bit. Of course, the more data you see, that probability goes down, but nevertheless, it was overfitting. And I think that highlights an issue with the evaluations, which is you can kind of push the delusion of the system past the point where humans are able to measure it, but that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means we're not able to measure it. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So big round of applause again for Chris.